My name is Sarah Martinez, and I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and the secrets our loved ones keep. 3 months ago, I was just another 28-year-old struggling to make ends meet in Cleveland, Ohio, working double shifts at Murphy's Diner on Euclid Avenue while trying to pay off my $47,000 in student loans from Cleveland State University. Today, I'm sitting in the leather chair of a downtown law office, holding documents that prove my entire family wrong about the woman they called Crazy Old Elena. Let me take you back to where this all began, on that cold Tuesday morning in October that changed my life forever. I was standing in my cramped studio apartment on East 55th Street, the kind of place where you can touch both walls if you stretch your arms wide. The morning light was filtering through my single window, casting long shadows across the mismatched furniture I'd collected from garage sales and curb finds over the years. I was getting ready for my 6 a.m. shift at the diner, pulling on the polyester uniform that always smelled like grease no matter how many times I washed it. The autumn leaves outside were turning that brilliant orange and red that makes Cleveland beautiful for exactly 2 weeks before winter crushes everything into gray slush. I was rushing, as always, because taking the bus meant leaving an hour early just to make sure I wouldn't be late. My phone was charging on the kitchen counter next to my coffee maker, a $15 secondhand Mr. Coffee that had been my biggest luxury purchase in months. That's when it rang. The caller ID showed my Aunt Carmen's number, and my stomach immediately dropped like a stone. Carmen only called with bad news. In our family, good news was shared over Sunday dinner or through casual visits. Bad news came through early morning phone calls. "Sarah, mija!" Her voice was shaking, trembling in a way I'd never heard before. Carmen was the strong one in our family, the one who held everyone together during crisis. Hearing her voice break made my hands start shaking before she even said the words. "Your mama, she's gone." The words hit me like a physical blow, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. I dropped my coffee mug and it shattered across my tiny apartment's linoleum floor, the brown liquid spreading in a pattern that looked disturbingly like a map of some unknown territory. The sound of ceramic breaking seemed to echo forever in the sudden, terrible silence. "What do you mean, gone?" I whispered, even though I knew exactly what she meant. Sometimes your brain refuses to process information that's too big, too devastating to be real. Mom had been in the hospital for pneumonia for a week. Metro Health Medical Center, the same hospital where she'd taken me for every childhood scrape and fever. The doctors had said she was responding well to treatment, that her oxygen levels were improving. She was supposed to come home that weekend. We'd made plans to watch our favorite telenovela together on Sunday night, sharing a bowl of the arroz con pollo she made better than anyone in Cleveland. Her heart gave out during the night. Carmen was crying now, her words coming between gasps for air. The nurses said it was peaceful, that she didn't suffer. She just slipped away in her sleep around 3 a.m. They tried to revive her, but I sank onto my secondhand couch, the one with the faded floral pattern that Mom had helped me pick out at a thrift store 3 years ago. She'd insisted on testing every cushion, making sure it was comfortable enough for the long study sessions I'd need to get through my business degree. "This is an investment in your future, mija," she'd said, running her hands over the fabric. "Everything we do is an investment in your future." The reality of those words, "Your mama is gone," hit me in waves. First came the denial, the absolute certainty that there had been some mistake. Then came the guilt, flooding through me like ice water. I should have been there. I should have insisted on staying overnight at the hospital instead of going home to get ready for work. I should have known something was wrong. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, phone calls to relatives I hadn't talked to in years, and the surreal experience of planning a ceremony to say goodbye to the most important person in my world. Mom had left specific instructions for her funeral. She'd planned everything down to the hymns she wanted sung and the flowers she preferred. Even in death, Sarah Martinez was organized and thoughtful. The family gathering at Carmen's house the night before the funeral was where I first heard the whispers that would change everything. Carmen lived in a small ranch house on West 25th Street, the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's business and front porches served as community centers during summer evenings. That night, her living room was packed with relatives I saw maybe twice a year, all speaking in the hushed tones reserved for discussing the recently departed. The house smelled like coffee and the pastels that Aunt Rosa had made for the occasion. People balanced paper plates on their knees while they talked, their voices creating a constant murmur of Spanish and English that had been the soundtrack of every family gathering I could remember. I was sitting in the corner, still numb with grief, when I started really listening to the conversations around me. "Poor Elena," my cousin Miguel was saying, shaking his head as he nursed a Budweiser from Carmen's refrigerator. Miguel worked construction and had the weathered hands and permanent tan that came with outdoor labor. Worked herself to death and had nothing to show for it. Absolutely nothing. Remember how she used to talk about her secret savings? My Aunt Rosa laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. It was the laugh people use when they're trying to be gentle about someone else's delusions. Rosa had always been the practical one, the family member who managed budgets and made sure bills got paid on time, always going on about how she was putting money away for Sarah's future. We all knew she was just trying to save face, trying to make herself feel better about never being able to help financially. She lived paycheck to paycheck like the rest of us. Uncle Roberto chimed in from his spot near the window. Roberto was Carmen's husband, a quiet man who worked at the Ford plant and had strong opinions about money management. The woman bought her clothes at thrift stores and ate beans and rice every single night. What secret savings? She probably had $50 in her checking account, maybe $100 if she was lucky. It was sweet, though, added my cousin Maria, Miguel's wife, the way she always talked about providing for Sarah's future. You could tell it made her feel important, like she was building something, even if it wasn't real. I wanted to defend her, to stand up and tell them they were wrong, but the truth was, they weren't wrong about her financial situation. At least, not that I could see. Mom had always been secretive about money, deflecting my questions with jokes or changing the subject entirely. Whenever I tried to help with bills or offer to contribute more to household expenses during my college years, she'd wave me off with that stubborn smile of hers. "Mija, don't worry about your mama," she'd say, usually while stirring something delicious on the stove of her tiny apartment kitchen. "I have everything under control. You focus on your studies, on building your career. That's what's important." But looking around at Carmen's living room, at the family that had always struggled to make ends meet, despite everyone working multiple jobs, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe Mom's talk about savings and providing for my future had just been the hopeful dreams of a woman who worked too hard for too little money in a country that didn't always reward hard work with financial security. The conversation continued around me, family members sharing memories of Mom's work ethic and generosity. She'd cleaned houses for wealthy families in Shaker Heights and Beechwood for 30 years, leaving her own home at 5 a.m. to scrub other people's bathrooms and vacuum their Persian rugs. She'd never missed a day of work, never complained about the physical toll it took on her body, never expressed resentment about the vast difference between her life and the lives of her employers. "Elena was the hardest worker I ever knew," said my great-aunt Esperanza, who was pushing 80 and had known Mom since she first arrived from Mexico. But hard work doesn't always translate to money in the bank, especially not for people like us. The phrase, "people like us," hung in the air like smoke. It carried the weight of generations of struggle, of families who worked multiple jobs just to keep the lights on, of dreams deferred and sacrifices made for the next generation. It was a phrase that acknowledged a reality none of us wanted to discuss directly, that for all our hard work and good intentions, most of us would never escape the cycle of living paycheck to paycheck. That night, I lay in my childhood bed in Mom's apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. The apartment felt too quiet without the sound of her moving around in the kitchen, preparing for the next day's work. Her bedroom was across the hall, and I could see the edge of her dresser through the partially open door, the same dresser where she'd kept the small lockbox with important papers that I'd need to sort through eventually. The funeral was held at St. Anthony's Catholic Church on West 25th Street, the same church where Mom had lit candles every Sunday for 28 years. She'd been part of the 7 a.m. Spanish Mass congregation, the early service that attracted mostly older immigrants and people who had to work later in the day. Father Martinez, who had known Mom since I was in elementary school, conducted the service in both Spanish and English, acknowledging the bilingual nature of our community. The morning was overcast with that particular kind of Ohio gray that makes everything look washed out and tired. Lake Erie was churning with pre-winter storms, and you could smell the moisture in the air even inside the church. I sat in the front pew, wearing the only black dress I owned, a simple sheath I'd bought at Target for job interviews. Listening to Father Martinez speak about Mom's dedication to her family and her faith. Elena Martinez was a woman of quiet strength, he said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings and stained glass windows that had been donated by parishioners over decades of small contributions. She may not have had material wealth, but she was rich in love and devotion to her daughter. She understood that the greatest inheritance we can leave is not money, but the example of how to live with dignity and purpose. The words stung because they felt like a gentle way of saying what everyone was thinking. That Mom had died poor, leaving me with nothing but memories and probably some debt to sort through. The congregation was full of people who had known her for years, other housekeepers, neighbors from our apartment building, members of the church community who had watched me grow up. They nodded along with Father Martinez's words, their faces reflecting the same resigned acceptance I'd heard in my family's conversations the night before. After the service, we drove to Riverside Cemetery in a procession of old cars and borrowed vehicles. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the Cuyahoga River, and on clearer days, you could see downtown Cleveland's skyline in the distance, the terminal tower, and the new buildings that represented the city's ongoing attempts to reinvent itself. Today, everything was gray and muted, matching the heaviness in my chest. Riverside Cemetery was one of Cleveland's older cemeteries, established in the 1870s when the city was growing rapidly with waves of immigrants from Europe. The headstones told the story of Cleveland's development, elaborate Victorian monuments for the wealthy families who had built the city's industry, simple markers for the working-class families who had provided the labor. Mom's grave would be in the newer section, where the headstones were smaller and the lots more affordable. As they lowered Mom's casket into the ground, I found myself thinking about all the conversations we'd had about the future. She'd always been so confident, so sure that everything would work out for me. When I'd stressed about my student loans or worried about my dead-end job at the diner, she'd pat my hand and smile in that way that made me believe everything really would be okay. "Don't worry, Micha," she'd say, usually while we were sitting at her small kitchen table sharing dinner. "Your mama has plans. Everything is going to be okay. You're going to have opportunities I never had, chances to build something real." Standing there in the drizzling rain, watching dirt fall onto the wooden box that held the most important person in my world, those words felt like cruel jokes. There were no plans. There was no secret nest egg. There was just me, alone, with a mountain of debt and a future that looked as gray as the October sky. The reception after the burial was held in the church basement, where the ladies' auxiliary had set up tables with food donated by parishioners. Paper plates and plastic forks, folding chairs arranged in clusters, the kind of gathering that happened after every funeral in our community. People shared stories about Mom, talked about her work ethic and her devotion to me, and gradually the conversation turned to practical matters. "Sarah's going to need help sorting through Elena's things," Carmen said to a group of women near the coffee station. "That apartment is full of 30 years of memories. Does she have any life insurance?" asked Mrs. Gutierrez, who lived in the same building as Mom. "Even a small policy would help with expenses." "I think there's something through the church," Rosa replied. "But you know Elena, she never talked about money. Sarah's going to have to figure it all out herself." I listened to these conversations with growing dread. In the space of a week, I'd gone from being someone's daughter to being completely alone in the world. And along with that devastating emotional reality came practical concerns I'd never had to face before. Mom's apartment would need to be cleaned out. Her few possessions would need to be sorted and distributed. Any debts she'd left behind would become my responsibility. But as the last handful of earth fell onto the grave earlier that day, something inside me had shifted. Maybe it was grief, or maybe it was the beginning of something else entirely. But I'd made a silent promise to my mother's memory. I was going to prove them all wrong. Somehow, some way, I was going to honor the faith she'd had in our future. I just had no idea that the proof I was looking for was literally right beneath my feet, waiting in the most unlikely place imaginable. The days following Mom's funeral were the hardest of my life, but not just because of the grief. Losing someone you love is devastating enough, but losing the person who believed in you most creates a specific kind of emptiness that's hard to describe. It's like losing your biggest cheerleader and your safety net at the same time. I'd taken 2 weeks off from Murphy's Diner using the bereavement leave policy, but my manager, Gary, had made it clear that he expected me back soon. "I'm sorry for your loss, Sarah, but we're short-staffed already," he'd said over the phone, his voice carrying that particular mixture of sympathy and impatience that comes from managing a business on thin margins. "Take the time you need, but don't take too long." The financial pressure was real. My rent was $650 a month for the studio apartment, which was actually a good deal by Cleveland standards, but still represented nearly half of my take-home pay from the diner. I had student loan payments of $347 every month, plus car insurance, phone bill, and groceries. Mom's death hadn't paused any of those obligations. Mom's landlord, Mr. Peterson, had given me 30 days to clean out her apartment before he re-rented it. Peterson was a decent man who owned several small buildings in the neighborhood, and he'd been patient with Mom over the years when money was tight. But he was also running a business, and 30 days was already generous considering the demand for affordable housing in Cleveland. "I'm sorry about your mother, Sarah," he'd said when I'd stopped by his office on Lorraine Avenue to discuss the situation. "Elena was a good tenant for 15 years, never caused any trouble, but I've got a waiting list of people who need apartments, and I can't afford to let the place sit empty." I understood the business reality, but the task felt overwhelming. 30 days to sort through 30 years of someone's life, to decide what was worth keeping and what could be donated or thrown away. It meant making decisions about objects that had been important to Mom, but might be meaningless to anyone else. It meant saying goodbye to her space, the last physical connection I had to her daily life. I started with her bedroom, the most personal space in the small 2-bedroom apartment on East 93rd Street. Mom had lived simply, but she'd kept everything organized and clean. Her closet was full of the practical clothes I remembered, faded work uniforms from the cleaning service where she'd worked for over a decade, sturdy shoes with worn soles that told the story of thousands of miles walked on other people's floors, and a few nice dresses she'd worn to church on Sundays and special occasions. The dresses broke my heart. They were beautiful in their simplicity. A navy blue one with small white flowers that she'd worn to my high school graduation, a black one with pearl buttons that had been her special occasion dress for weddings and quinceañeras. Each one had been carefully maintained, hung on proper hangers and covered with plastic dry cleaning bags, even though I knew she'd probably paid to have them professionally cleaned, maybe twice in the entire time she'd owned them. In her dresser, I found layers of memories organized with the same care she'd brought to everything else in her life. The top drawer held everyday items, reading glasses she'd bought at the dollar store, hand cream for the dry skin that came from constant exposure to cleaning chemicals, a small jewelry box with the modest pieces she'd owned, a wedding ring from my father who'd died when I was 3, a small cross necklace that had been a gift from her mother in Mexico, and a pair of pearl earrings I'd given her for Mother's Day 3 years earlier. The second drawer was full of photographs, prayer cards, and letters from relatives in Mexico that she'd saved for years. Some of the letters were decades old, written on thin airmail paper in Spanish, describing family events and asking about our life in America. There were pictures of me at every stage of childhood, school photos and candid shots that chronicled my growth from a gap-toothed 6-year-old to my college graduation. She'd kept everything: report cards, certificates from school awards, even the program from my high school drama club's production of Our Town, where I'd played a small role as a townsperson. Looking through these memories, I was struck by how carefully Mom had documented my life, while revealing almost nothing about her own internal world. There were no diaries, no personal letters, no evidence of dreams or aspirations beyond my success and happiness. It was as if she'd channeled all of her hopes into my future, leaving little room for her own desires. But it was when I found her notebook that everything began to change. I was lifting the mattress to check if anything had fallen between the bed and the wall when I felt something hard and rectangular. The notebook was tucked between the mattress and box spring, positioned so carefully that it had to have been placed there intentionally. It was a small composition book with a marbled black and white cover, the kind students use for school assignments, but the pages were filled with Mom's careful handwriting in a mixture of English and Spanish. At first, I thought it was a diary, and I hesitated to read it. Even though Mom was gone, it felt like a violation of her privacy. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized it was something else entirely. A detailed record of financial transactions that went back 15 years. The entries were organized by date and included amounts, locations, and cryptic notes that I didn't understand at first. Cedar Point Deposit, S's Future, $28.47. Riverside Monthly, for Mija's Dreams, $180. East Side Box Number 3, College Fund Edition, $150. The handwriting was meticulous, each entry made with a blue ballpoint pen in the same careful script Mom had used for grocery lists and birthday cards. But the numbers didn't make sense to me. They were too large, too consistent. According to this notebook, Mom had been setting aside significant amounts of money for years, amounts that seemed impossible given what I knew about her income and expenses. As a house cleaner working for a service, she'd made maybe $12 an hour, probably bringing home around $400 a week after taxes. How could she have been saving thousands of dollars while still paying rent, buying groceries, and covering all the other expenses of daily life? I sat on her bed for over an hour, flipping through page after page of entries, my heart racing as I tried to understand what I was looking at. If this was real, if these numbers meant what I thought they meant, then Mom hadn't been living paycheck to paycheck at all. She'd been systematically saving money and hiding it from everyone, including me. But where was it? And more importantly, why had she hidden it? The notebook contained references to locations I didn't recognize. Riverside Monthly appeared dozens of times, always with relatively small amounts, $150, $200, sometimes $300. East Side Box appeared less frequently, but with larger amounts. Cedar Point Deposit showed up 3 times over the years, always with substantial sums that made my head spin. That evening, I called Carmen to ask if she knew anything about Mom's finances beyond the basics. "Oh, honey," Carmen sighed over the phone when I described what I'd found. I could hear her washing dishes in the background, the familiar sound of domestic routine that seemed impossibly normal given what I was experiencing. "You found one of Elena's fantasy notebooks, didn't you? She used to write in those things like she was some kind of secret millionaire. It was her way of coping, I think. Making up stories about having money to leave you." "But Carmen, these entries are so detailed. They have specific dates and amounts, locations." "Sarah, listen to me." Carmen's voice took on the patient tone she used when she thought someone needed to hear a difficult truth. "I loved your mother like a sister, but she lived in a dream world sometimes. You know how she was always talking about providing for your future, about having plans? This is just more of the same. She probably wrote down amounts she wished she could save, places she imagined hiding money. It was her way of feeling like she was doing something important for you." I wanted to argue, but Carmen's explanation made a certain kind of sense. Mom had always been secretive about money, deflecting questions about her finances with vague reassurances. Maybe this notebook was just an elaborate fantasy, a way for her to feel like she was building something for my future, even when the reality was that she could barely make ends meet. But something about Carmen's explanation didn't sit right with me. Mom had been a practical woman, not given to fantasy or delusion. She'd faced the challenges of immigrant life in America with clear-eyed determination, never sugarcoating difficulties or pretending things were easier than they were. She'd been secretive about money, yes, but she'd never been dishonest with me about anything else. "Even if it's not real," I said to Carmen, "I think I need to check, just to be sure." "Of course, honey. You do what you need to do, but don't torture yourself looking for money that isn't there. Elena wouldn't want you to waste time chasing fantasies when you need to be planning your own future." After hanging up, I sat in Mom's quiet apartment, surrounded by the modest possessions of a woman who'd worked hard her entire life. The notebook was open on my lap, and I traced the careful lines of her handwriting with my finger. Whether or not the money was real, the notebook represented something important, evidence of how much she'd wanted to provide for me, how much thought she'd given to my future, even if she'd only been able to dream about the resources to make those dreams reality. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Over the next few days, I searched every inch of her apartment with the thoroughness of a detective investigating a crime scene. I looked behind furniture, inside books, in the freezer, and even under loose floorboards. I dismantled her bed completely, checked inside pillowcases and the lining of her winter coats. I went through every box in her small storage closet, examining Christmas decorations and old kitchen appliances she'd kept just in case. I found small treasures that meant everything to me and nothing to anyone else. A Mother's Day card I'd made in 2nd grade, my baby teeth carefully wrapped in tissue paper, a small collection of smooth stones I'd given her from a family trip to Lake Erie when I was 10 years old. But I found no hidden money, no secret bank statements, no evidence that the notebook represented anything more than wishful thinking. The family's reaction to my search was predictable and increasingly frustrating. Sarah's lost her mind, I overheard Rosa telling Miguel when I stopped by Carmen's house for Sunday dinner. They were standing in the kitchen, speaking in lowered voices, but the house was small and sound carried. She's tearing apart Elena's apartment looking for treasure like some kind of pirate. It's not healthy. It's grief, Miguel replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd experienced loss. People do strange things when they're processing death. My buddy Tony spent 6 months convinced his dad had hidden money in the walls of their house, ended up putting holes in perfectly good drywall before he finally accepted reality. I just hope she doesn't spend her own money chasing this fantasy, Rosa continued. Elena would be heartbroken to know that Sarah was wasting time and resources on something that doesn't exist, but I couldn't accept it. Something in Mom's notebook felt too real, too specific to be mere fantasy. The way she'd written about dates and locations, the consistency of her record-keeping over 15 years, it all suggested a level of organization and purpose that went beyond wishful thinking. The reference to Riverside Monthly particularly stuck with me. Riverside Cemetery was where we'd buried her just 3 weeks earlier. Why would she reference the cemetery in her financial records? What connection could there possibly be between that place and the money she claimed to be saving? It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the funeral, that I decided to visit Mom's grave. I hadn't been back since the burial, partly because I wasn't ready to face the finality of seeing her name carved in stone, and partly because I'd been consumed with searching her apartment and trying to understand the mystery of her notebook. The drive to Riverside Cemetery took me through neighborhoods I'd known my entire life, past the elementary school where Mom had walked me to kindergarten, past the grocery store where we'd shopped together every Saturday morning, past the church where we'd attended Mass together for decades. Each familiar landmark felt different now, loaded with memories that had become more precious and more painful since she'd died. Riverside Cemetery looked different in the daylight than it had on that gray funeral morning. The autumn colors were more vibrant, and despite the light rain, there was something peaceful about the rolling hills, dotted with headstones and monuments that told the stories of Cleveland's residents across more than a century. Old oak trees created a canopy over the winding roads, and in the distance, I could see the river that gave the cemetery its name. I parked my old Honda near the main office and walked up the winding path to the newer section where Mom was buried. The office building was a small brick structure that looked like it had been built in the 1960s, with a parking lot that needed repaving and flower beds that were probably beautiful in spring, but looked tired and brown in late October. The walk to Mom's grave took me past monuments that represented every era of Cleveland's history. Victorian-era obelisks mark the graves of the city's early industrial leaders, while simple granite stones from the mid-20th century showed the final resting places of working-class families like ours. Each section of the cemetery told part of the story of who had lived and died in this city, who had been remembered, and how. Mom's grave was still covered with the temporary marker from the funeral home. The permanent headstone wouldn't be ready for another month, but I'd already chosen the inscription, Elena Martinez, Beloved Mother, 1965-2023. Todo por mi hija, everything for my daughter. It had been her philosophy in life, and it seemed fitting that it should mark her final resting place. I stood there in the light rain, feeling the weight of her absence like a physical ache in my chest. The grass around her grave was still sparse, showing the recent disturbance of the burial. Someday, it would grow back and blend seamlessly with the surrounding lawn, but for now, it served as a visible reminder of how recently I'd lost her. I don't know what you were trying to tell me, Mom, I whispered, rain dripping from my hair onto the temporary marker. Everyone thinks I'm crazy for believing in your notebook, but I know you weren't lying to me. You never lied to me about anything. If you said you were saving money for my future, then you were saving money for my future. That's when I noticed something odd. About 10 feet away from Mom's grave, there was an elaborate monument that seemed completely out of place in this section of simple, modest headstones. It was a tall granite obelisk with ornate carved details, the kind of monument that probably cost more than Mom had made in several years of cleaning houses. But what caught my attention wasn't the monument itself. It was the small American flag planted next to it, and more specifically, the way the flag was positioned. The flag was angled directly toward Mom's grave, as if someone had deliberately aimed it in that direction. It wasn't perpendicular to the monument like most cemetery flags, and it wasn't simply stuck in the ground randomly. Someone had taken care to position it so that it pointed specifically toward the spot where Mom was buried. I walked over to examine the monument more closely, my heart starting to beat faster as I read the inscription. It belonged to someone named Theodore Harrison, who had died in 1987. The inscription read, "Theodore Harrison, beloved husband and father, 1924-1987. A man's true wealth is the good he does in this world." Something about the timing bothered me immediately. 1987 was the year before I was born, and according to Mom's notebook, her financial records started in 1988, the year of my birth. It could have been a coincidence, but after weeks of searching for answers, I was beginning to believe that nothing in Mom's life had been coincidental. The monument was impressive, clearly expensive, and meticulously maintained despite being over 30 years old. The granite was polished to a mirror shine, and there were fresh flowers at the base. Not the plastic arrangements that many families left for convenience, but real flowers that someone had placed there recently. I spent the next hour walking around that section of the cemetery, looking for any other connections to Mom or our family. Most of the graves in the area were from the 1980s and 1990s, and I recognized none of the names. The headstones told the typical stories of American families: beloved husbands and wives, cherished parents and grandparents, people who had lived full lives and been mourned by those who loved them. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold and my hands start shaking. There, carved into the base of Theodore Harrison's monument, almost hidden by the angle of the stone and the shadow cast by the obelisk, was a small symbol that I'd seen before, a simple cross with a circle around it. It was subtle, maybe 2 inches across, carved into the granite with the same skill as the rest of the monument's details. It was the same symbol that Mom had drawn in the margins of several pages in her notebook. I knelt down in the wet grass, tracing the symbol with my finger, my mind racing with possibilities. This couldn't be another coincidence. Mom had been referencing this place, this specific grave, in her financial records for 15 years. The symbol in her notebook matched the symbol on this stranger's monument. The timing of Theodore Harrison's death coincided with the beginning of Mom's record-keeping. But what was the connection? Who was Theodore Harrison, and why had Mom been thinking about him when she wrote about saving money for my future? As I drove home that evening, my mind was spinning with questions that seemed to have no logical answers. I kept thinking about Mom's secretive nature, her insistence that she had plans for my future, and now this strange connection to a stranger's grave in the same cemetery where she was buried. That night, I did something I should have done weeks earlier. I called the cemetery office and asked to speak with someone who had worked there for a long time. The receptionist, a kind-sounding older woman, transferred me to the head groundskeeper, a man named Frank Kowalski, who had been maintaining Riverside Cemetery for over 30 years. Theodore Harrison? Frank's voice was thoughtful when I asked about the monument. "Oh yeah, I remember that burial. Real sad case, actually. Nice man. Owned a small construction company on the west side. Did good work. Treated his employees well. His wife used to visit every week for years after he died. Always brought fresh flowers and spent a long time just sitting by his grave talking to him. Do you remember anything else about him? Or his wife?" "Well, let me think. Mrs. Harrison was a sweet lady, but she had some health problems that got worse as she got older. I think she moved away in the early 90s to live with family somewhere down south. Florida, maybe? Haven't seen her in probably 25 years or more. Why do you ask, if you don't mind me asking?" I explained about Mom's notebook and the strange connection I'd found, expecting Frank to dismiss it as coincidence or the grieving imagination of someone who'd lost her mother. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was careful, thoughtful. "You know," he said finally, "now that you mention it, I do remember seeing a Hispanic woman visiting that grave regularly over the years. Always thought it was a little odd, since the Harrisons didn't have any Hispanic family that I knew of, and Cleveland's Hispanic community wasn't as large then as it is now. She was quiet, respectful, always brought a small bouquet of flowers, never talked to anyone, just stood there for a few minutes and left. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. What did she look like? Small woman, probably in her 40s when I first noticed her visiting, maybe early 50s by the time I stopped seeing her regularly. Dark hair, usually wore simple clothes. Work clothes, you know? Practical stuff. Always carried herself with dignity, if you know what I mean. Had that look of someone who worked hard for everything she had. It was Mom. It had to be. The description matched perfectly, and the timing fit with everything I knew about her life in Cleveland. When did you stop seeing her? I asked. Oh, let me think. Probably sometime this past summer? Maybe June or July? I remember noticing that the flowers on Theodore's grave weren't getting refreshed as regularly, and I wondered what had happened to that faithful lady who'd been coming for so many years. That timeline matched exactly with when Mom had gotten sick and been hospitalized. She'd been visiting Theodore Harrison's grave for decades, maintaining it like family, and she'd only stopped when her illness prevented her from making the trips. Frank, I said, my voice barely steady, do you remember anything unusual about her visits? Did she ever do anything besides leave flowers? There was another long pause, and I could almost hear Frank thinking, probably wondering if he should share what he'd observed over the years. Well, he said finally, this might sound strange, but sometimes I'd see her kneeling by the monument, not like she was praying exactly, but like she was, I don't know, checking something. She'd run her hands along the base of the stone, around the back where most people don't go. Always wondered what she was doing back there. My hands were shaking as I thanked Frank and hung up the phone. Mom hadn't just been visiting Theodore Harrison's grave out of respect or obligation. She'd been doing something there, something that required her to examine the monument carefully, to check on something that was hidden. For years, she'd been visiting Theodore Harrison's grave, and somehow, that ritual was connected to the financial records in her notebook. The symbol carved into the monument matched the symbol in her notes. The timing of her visits matched the timeline of her savings records. But what was the connection? And more importantly, what had she been hiding there? As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, I realized that everyone who had laughed at Mom's fantasy savings was about to be proven very, very wrong. I just had to figure out how to find what she'd been protecting all those years. The next morning, I was back at Riverside Cemetery before the groundskeeping crew arrived for work. I'd barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities and theories about what Mom might have hidden at Theodore Harrison's grave. I brought a small flashlight, a magnifying glass I'd borrowed from Carmen, and a determination to solve this mystery once and for all. The cemetery looked different in the early morning light. Mist was rising from the river in the distance, and the autumn air was crisp enough to make my breath visible. There was something peaceful about being there before the day officially began, when the only sounds were birds and the distant hum of traffic from the city below. I walked directly to Theodore Harrison's monument, my heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. In the clear morning light, I could see details I'd missed during my previous visits. The granite was indeed high quality, probably imported, and the carving work was exceptional. Whoever had commissioned this monument had spared no expense in honoring Theodore Harrison's memory. I began examining every inch of the monument systematically, running my hands along the carved surfaces just as Frank had described Mom doing over the years. The front of the monument was smooth, polished granite with the inscription clearly visible. The sides featured decorative elements, carved flowers and geometric patterns that were beautiful but seemed purely ornamental. But when I moved to the back of the monument, where it would be hidden from casual view, I found something that made my heart stop. There, carved into the granite with the same skill as the rest of the monument, but positioned so that it would only be visible to someone specifically looking for it, was a series of small symbols. The cross with a circle that I'd seen before, but also numbers and what looked like coordinates or directions. R15E was carved in small, precise letters. Below that, G7N. And at the bottom, almost hidden by the base of the monument, THEM 1987. Theodore Harrison and Elena Martinez, 1987. The year he died and the year before I was born. The year Mom started keeping her financial records. I sat back on my heels, my mind racing to put together the pieces of a puzzle that was bigger and more complex than I'd imagined. Mom hadn't just known Theodore Harrison. They'd had some kind of partnership or agreement that dated back to 1987. And whatever that agreement was, It involved hiding something valuable enough that Mom had been protecting it for over 30 years. The symbols that looked like coordinates were the key to finding whatever they'd hidden together: R15E and G7N. If these were directions from the monument, then R probably meant right, G probably meant grave, and the numbers represented distances or positions. I stood up and began pacing off distances from the monument. 15 steps to the right, east, brought me to an area of the cemetery that looked no different from any other section. Modest headstones, well-maintained grass, nothing that stood out as unusual. But when I started looking for G7N, the seventh grave to the north, I found myself standing in front of a simple granite marker that read, Margaret Harrison, 1930-1991, beloved wife of Theodore. Margaret Harrison. Theodore's wife, who according to Frank had moved away in the early 1990s to live with family in Florida. Except according to this headstone, she hadn't moved away at all. She'd died in 1991 and been buried here, next to her husband. I knelt down beside Margaret Harrison's grave, my hands shaking as I began to examine the ground around her headstone. The grass here looked different from the surrounding area. Not dramatically different, but noticeable if you were looking for it. The soil was slightly raised, as if the earth beneath had been disturbed and replaced more recently than the date on the headstone would suggest. I looked around the cemetery to make sure I was alone, then pulled out the small gardening trowel I'd brought. I know how this sounds. Digging around graves in broad daylight probably looked like the behavior of someone who'd completely lost their grip on reality. But I was beyond caring what people thought. Mom's notebook, the symbols on Theodore Harrison's monument, and now the discovery of Margaret Harrison's grave had created a trail of clues that I was determined to follow to the end. I started digging carefully about 2 feet from the base of Margaret Harrison's headstone, in the area where the grass looked most recently disturbed. The soil was soft, much softer than I'd expected for ground that should have been undisturbed for over 30 years. About 8 inches down, my trowel hit something hard and metallic. It was a metal box, larger than I'd expected, maybe 12 inches square and 6 inches deep. The box was wrapped in several layers of plastic and tape, clearly protected against moisture and decay. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely untie the plastic wrapping. Inside the outer wrapping was a steel document box, the kind lawyers and accountants use for storing important papers. It was secured with a combination lock, and taped to the top was a small envelope with my name written in Mom's familiar handwriting. For Sarah, when she is ready to understand, the envelope said. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 numbers, 10-12-88. My birthday, October 12th, 1988. The combination lock opened easily with those numbers, and inside the box was a treasure trove of documents that would change my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my mother's life. Bank statements going back to 1988, showing steady deposits and careful investment strategies. Property deeds for 3 small rental houses in Cleveland neighborhoods that were just beginning to gentrify. Stock certificates for companies I recognized, solid, dividend-paying stocks that had grown steadily over decades. Insurance policies with substantial death benefits. And most shocking of all, a business partnership agreement between Sarah Martinez and Theodore Harrison, dated 1987. According to the documents, Theodore Harrison hadn't just been a construction company owner. He'd been a real estate investor with a talent for identifying undervalued properties in neighborhoods that were likely to appreciate. In 1987, shortly before his death, he'd entered into a partnership with Mom, who had provided labor and local knowledge in exchange for a share of the profits from property renovations and rentals. The agreement was simple but brilliant. Theodore would identify properties with potential, Mom would provide the cleaning and renovation labor at below-market rates, and they would split the profits when the properties were sold or rented. Theodore's sudden death from a heart attack had left Mom as the sole owner of their partnership, inheriting not just the properties they'd already acquired, but also Theodore's investment knowledge and strategy. Margaret Harrison, according to a letter in the box, had been grateful for Mom's partnership with her husband. Theodore had been planning to expand his real estate business when he died, and Margaret couldn't manage the properties alone. Rather than sell everything at a loss, she'd helped Mom understand the business and encouraged her to continue Theodore's investment strategy. "Your mother was the smartest person I ever met," Margaret's letter said. "Theodore saw her potential immediately. She had a gift for understanding which neighborhoods were going to improve, which properties were worth investing in. After Theodore died, she could have taken the easy money and sold everything. Instead, she built an empire. An empire. That's what Mom had built while everyone thought she was barely getting by. The documents showed a systematic approach to wealth building that spanned over 30 years. She'd started with the properties from her partnership with Theodore, then used the rental income to buy more properties, then diversified into stocks and bonds as her portfolio grew. The most recent statements were dated just 2 months before her death. According to the documents, Mom had accumulated assets worth over $850,000. $850,000. I had to read the number 3 times before it sank in. My mother, who everyone thought had died poor, had quietly built a substantial fortune while scrubbing other people's bathrooms and living on beans and rice. She'd been a millionaire in everything but title, and she'd done it all while maintaining the appearance of someone who was struggling financially. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. At the bottom of the document box was a folder labeled "For Sarah's Future" in Mom's careful handwriting. Inside were detailed plans for how I should manage the inheritance, including specific recommendations for which properties to keep, which investments to maintain, and how to continue growing the wealth she'd built. There were also personal letters, dozens of them, written over the years but never sent. Letters explaining her choices, her sacrifices, her dreams for my future. Letters apologizing for the secrecy, but explaining why she'd felt it was necessary to hide her success from family members who might try to claim a share or pressure her to spend the money on immediate needs rather than long-term investments. "My dearest Sarah," one letter began, "I know this will be hard to understand, but I had to keep our family's wealth secret. Not because I was ashamed of our success, but because I wanted to protect it. I've seen too many families destroyed by money. Too many people who think they deserve a share of what someone else worked to build. This fortune is for you and your children, not for relatives who laughed at my dreams." I sat in the grass beside Margaret Harrison's grave, surrounded by documents that proved my mother had been the smartest, most strategic person I'd ever known. She'd spent 30 years building wealth while maintaining the appearance of poverty, protecting her investment strategy by letting everyone underestimate her capabilities. The papers showed that she'd owned rental properties in Ohio City before it became trendy, in Tremont before the artists moved in Detroit Shoreway before young professionals discovered it. She'd bought stock in Apple in the early 1990s, in Amazon when it was just a bookstore, in Google before anyone knew what it would become. Every investment had been carefully researched and strategically timed, and the entire time, our family had pitied her, had whispered about her delusions and fantasies, had treated her like a sweet but impractical dreamer who lived in a world of make-believe. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in Riverside Cemetery, reading through every document in Mom's hidden treasure box. Each paper revealed another layer of the sophisticated financial operation she'd been running in secret for 3 decades. The scope of her success was staggering, but even more impressive was the strategic thinking behind every decision she'd made. The rental properties alone told an incredible story. In 1988, she'd used her share of the partnership with Theodore Harrison to buy a small duplex on Literary Road for $18,000. The neighborhood was rough then, but Mom had seen potential that others missed. She'd spent weekends renovating the property herself, using skills she'd learned from watching Theodore's construction crews. By 1995, the property was worth $45,000 and generating $800 a month in rental income. She'd repeated this process throughout the 1990s and 2000s, always staying ahead of Cleveland's gentrification patterns. While other people were complaining about changing neighborhoods, Mom was buying properties before the changes made them expensive. She understood that young professionals would eventually discover Ohio City's proximity to downtown. She predicted that artists would transform Tremont into a hip cultural district. She saw Detroit Shoreway's potential before developers started building trendy condos along the lake. The stock portfolio was equally impressive. She'd started with safe, dividend-paying stocks, companies like Coca-Cola and Johnson & Johnson that she understood from her daily life. But as her knowledge grew, she'd branched out into technology stocks, carefully researching companies and investing small amounts that grew into substantial holdings over time. One letter, dated 2010, explained her investment philosophy. "I buy stock in companies I understand, companies that make products I use or see my employers using. I don't try to get rich quick. I just try to get rich slowly, one good decision at a time. But perhaps the most revealing documents were her detailed budgets, showing exactly how she'd managed to save so much money while appearing to live paycheck to paycheck. She'd tracked every expense, every saving opportunity, every chance to redirect money from consumption to investment. Bought bread at day-old store instead of regular grocery. Saved $3, invested in mutual fund. Read one typical entry. Walked to work instead of taking bus. Saved $1.50, added to stock purchase fund. Repaired winter coat instead of buying new one. Saved $85, put toward property down payment. Thousands of small decisions, made consistently over decades, had created the foundation for substantial wealth. While other people were upgrading their cars, eating at restaurants, or buying new clothes, Mom was calculating the opportunity cost of every purchase and choosing long-term wealth over short-term comfort. The most emotional document was a letter she'd written to me in 2015, explaining why she'd kept her success secret even from me. "My precious Sarah, I know you worry about me, about whether I have enough money for groceries and rent. I see you calculating in your head when we're at the store together, wondering if you should offer to pay for things. It breaks my heart to let you worry, but I can't tell you the truth yet. You're too generous, too caring. If you knew how much money we really have, you'd want to help your cousins pay for college, help Uncle Roberto when the factory cuts his hours, help everyone in the family with their problems. And then the money would be gone, spent on other people's emergencies, instead of saved for your future. I'm not being selfish. I'm being strategic. This wealth is for you and your children, not for people who never believed in our ability to succeed." Reading those words, I finally understood the incredible burden Mom had carried. She'd spent years letting people think she was poor, letting them pity her, letting them treat her like someone who needed help, all to protect the wealth she was building for my future. The strength and discipline that had required was almost incomprehensible. By mid-afternoon, I'd inventoried everything in the box and created a rough estimate of the total inheritance. The rental properties were currently worth about $340,000 and generating over $4,000 a month in income. The stock portfolio was worth approximately $380,000, with dividends providing another $800 monthly. The various bank accounts and CDs totaled another $140,000. Including the life insurance policies and a few other assets, Mom had left me a total inheritance worth just over $900,000. $900,000, almost $1 million that everyone in my family thought didn't exist. I carefully repacked everything in the metal box and returned it to its hiding place under Margaret Harrison's grave. I wasn't ready to reveal the discovery yet. I needed time to process what I'd learned and plan how to handle the family's reaction. I also wanted to verify the documents to make sure everything was real and legal before I announced that Mom had been a secret millionaire. The next morning, I took a personal day from the diner and spent it visiting the banks, investment firms, and property management companies listed in Mom's documents. At each location, I presented Mom's death certificate and the relevant paperwork, explaining that I was settling her estate. The response was consistent and shocking. Everyone knew Elena Martinez. Everyone spoke of her with respect and admiration. She wasn't just an account holder. She was remembered as one of their most knowledgeable and strategic clients. "Your mother was remarkable," said Janet Morrison, the investment advisor at KeyBank, who had managed Mom's stock portfolio for over 15 years. She never made an emotional decision, never panicked during market downturns, never chased trends or fads. She had a 20-year investment horizon and the discipline to stick to her strategy, even when other clients were freaking out about temporary losses. "She understood real estate better than most professionals I know," added Mike Chen, who managed several of Mom's rental properties. "She could walk through a neighborhood and tell you which blocks were going to appreciate in value within 5 years. She had an intuitive understanding of demographic trends and urban development patterns." Each conversation confirmed what the documents had already told me. Mom hadn't just been lucky or fortunate. She'd been brilliant, disciplined, and strategic in ways that even investment professionals found impressive. That evening, I called Carmen and asked her to arrange a family meeting for the following Sunday. "Is everything okay, honey?" Carmen asked, concern evident in her voice. "You sound different." "Everything's fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. but I need to share some information about Mom's estate with everyone. There are some things the family needs to know." "Oh, Sarah," Carmen sighed. "Please tell me you're not still chasing those fantasy notebook stories. You need to accept reality and move on with your life. Just trust me, Carmen. Sunday at your house, around 2 p.m. Make sure everyone is there." Word about the family meeting spread quickly, and by Friday, my phone was ringing constantly with relatives wanting to know what was going on. Some were concerned about me, worried that I was having some kind of breakdown. Others were clearly hoping that I'd found some money after all, and that there might be something in it for them. I didn't answer most of the calls. I needed time to prepare for what was going to be a difficult conversation that would change how our family saw Mom's memory and my future. The family meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon at Carmen's house on West 25th Street. By 1:30 p.m., the small ranch house was packed with relatives I hadn't seen since the funeral, and the atmosphere was tense with curiosity and barely concealed anticipation. I arrived carrying 2 briefcases, one with copies of all the financial documents, and another with the personal letters Mom had written explaining her choices and strategies. The living room felt smaller than usual, with so many people crowded inside, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me as I set up my materials on Carmen's coffee table. Uncle Roberto was there with his wife, looking skeptical and slightly impatient. Miguel and Maria had brought their teenage son, probably thinking this was an important family event he should witness. Rosa sat next to Carmen on the couch, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. My great-aunt Esperanza, now in her 80s, had even made the trip from her apartment on the west side. "So, Sarah," Uncle Roberto said before I'd even finished organizing my papers, "Carmen tells us you think Elena left you some money. We're all family here. How much are we talking about?" I looked around the room at faces I'd known my whole life. People who had loved Mom, but had never really understood her strength, her intelligence, or her capabilities. People who were about to learn that they had completely misjudged the most remarkable woman any of us had ever known. "Before I share the details," I said, opening my first briefcase, "I want everyone to remember exactly what you said about Mom's financial situation. I want you to remember how you laughed at her fantasies about having savings. I want you to remember every time you treated her like someone who needed help, someone who was barely getting by." Rosa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Sarah, we weren't being mean. We were being realistic. We just didn't want you to get your hopes up about money that wasn't there." "Except it was there," I said, pulling out the bank statements and property deeds. "All of it. Every penny Mom said she was saving for my future, and more money than any of you ever imagined she could accumulate." I began spreading the documents across Carmen's coffee table, like a deck of cards revealing a winning hand. Bank statements showing account balances in the hundreds of thousands, investment portfolios demonstrating steady growth over 30 years, property deeds for multiple rental homes in Cleveland's most desirable neighborhoods, insurance policies with substantial death benefits, a comprehensive financial plan that would have impressed any professional wealth manager. The room went completely silent. The kind of silence that happens when people's fundamental assumptions about reality are suddenly challenged by undeniable evidence. Miguel was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. This is real? These numbers are real?" "Every single document," I confirmed. "Mom left me over $900,000 in total assets. She also left detailed instructions for how to manage the investments and continue growing the wealth she spent 30 years building. But how?" Carmen was staring at the documents like they might disappear if she looked away. "Elena made minimum wage cleaning houses. She lived in that tiny apartment, shopped at thrift stores, ate the same simple meals every day. Where did this money come from?" I pulled out Mom's letters and began reading portions aloud, sharing her explanation of how she'd systematically saved and invested every spare dollar for 3 decades while living on the absolute minimum. I told them about Theodore Harrison, about the real estate partnership that had started her journey to wealth, about the careful research and strategic thinking behind every investment decision. "She worked double shifts whenever possible," I continued, my voice getting stronger as I shared Mom's story. "She bought day-old bread and shopped at discount grocery stores. She repaired her clothes instead of buying new ones. She walked to work instead of taking the bus when weather permitted. She never bought anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Every single sacrifice was calculated to maximize what she could save and invest for my future." I read them excerpts from Mom's letters explaining her investment philosophy, her understanding of real estate trends, her research into stock selections. I showed them the detailed budgets demonstrating exactly how she'd managed to save substantial amounts while appearing to live paycheck to paycheck. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see the realization dawning on their faces, not just that Mom had been wealthy, but that they had completely misjudged her intelligence, her capabilities, and her dedication to my future. "We thought she was struggling," Rosa said finally, tears streaming down her face. "All those times we offered to help her with groceries or bills, all those times we worried about whether she could afford to keep her apartment. She was struggling," I said. "She was struggling every day to build something better for me, while making it look effortless. She was struggling to accumulate wealth while keeping everyone from knowing about it, because she knew that family members would pressure her to spend it on immediate needs instead of long-term investments." Uncle Roberto looked like he'd been physically struck. "Elena was smarter than all of us put together, and we treated her like she was simple, like she didn't understand how money worked." "She wasn't simple," I said, my voice getting stronger as I defended Mom's memory. "She was sophisticated. She was brilliant. She understood economics and investments better than most people with business degrees. She was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, thinking decades ahead while other people could barely plan for next week." The conversation that followed was painful, but necessary. One by one, family members admitted how wrong they'd been about Mom. They shared memories of times when she'd refused help or declined invitations that cost money, and now they understood that every no had been a calculated decision to prioritize my future over immediate gratification or social expectations. "I remember she never came to restaurants with us," Maria said, her voice full of regret. "We thought it was because she couldn't afford it, but really, it was because she was investing that money instead. She never bought new clothes," added Carmen. "Always shopped at thrift stores and consignment shops. We felt sorry for her, but she was probably saving hundreds of dollars every year that way. Remember how she always brought lunch to family gatherings instead of offering to pay for catering or takeout?" Miguel said. "We thought she was being cheap, but she was being strategic." But then came the moment I'd been dreading, the question that would test everything Mom had taught me about protecting wealth from well-meaning family members. "So," Miguel said carefully, clearing his throat and looking around the room at the other relatives, "what happens now? I know Elena technically left this to you, but we're all family. Surely she would have wanted to help everyone. I mean, there's enough here to make a real difference in all our lives." The mood in the room shifted instantly and dramatically. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the sudden interest in reconnecting with the niece they'd barely spoken to between family gatherings. The same people who had pitied Mom for her supposed poverty were now looking at me like I held the solution to all their financial problems. "My student loans are crushing me," Maria said quickly. "Elena always said education was important. She would want me to finish my nursing degree without debt." "The factory's cutting hours again," Roberto added. "Just a small loan would help us get through the winter without losing the house." "Rosa's been talking about starting a catering business," Carmen chimed in. "A little investment capital would help her follow her dreams." I looked around the room at people I'd loved my entire life, people who were now revealing exactly why Mom had kept her wealth secret. Within minutes of learning about the inheritance, they were already planning how to spend it, already assuming that family loyalty meant sharing what Mom had sacrificed to provide specifically for me. "Mom was very clear about her intentions," I said, my voice cool and steady despite the emotional turmoil I was feeling. "This money is specifically for my future and the future of my children. She spent 30 years sacrificing so that I could have opportunities none of us have ever had." "But Sarah," Carmen said, her voice taking on the pleading tone that family members use when they want something they can't demand. "Family helps family. Elena would want you to share with people who are struggling. She was always generous, always thinking about others." "Elena had 30 years to share if that's what she wanted," I interrupted, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "She chose not to. She chose to give it all to me. And she earned the right to make that choice through decades of sacrifice and careful planning." I pulled out one of Mom's letters and read a section aloud. "Sarah will be tempted to help family members who ask for money because she has a generous heart like her mama. But she must remember that this wealth took 30 years to build. and it can be destroyed in 30 minutes if she's not careful. People who never believed in our ability to succeed will suddenly have opinions about how our money should be spent. Don't let them convince you that their immediate wants are more important than your long-term security. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could see disappointment and anger on some faces, understanding and acceptance on others. I'm not saying I'll never help family, I continued, trying to balance firmness with compassion. But I'm also not going to apologize for inheriting what my mother worked so hard to give me. She trusted me to use this money wisely, to honor her sacrifices by building on what she created. That's exactly what I'm going to do. The aftermath of that conversation revealed a lot about family dynamics and human nature. Some relatives distanced themselves when they realized I wasn't going to be writing checks to solve everyone's problems. Others, like Carmen, came to understand and respect Mom's wishes after they had time to process the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. "I'm proud of Elena," Carmen told me a week later over coffee at a diner near her house. "And I'm proud of you for standing up for her wishes. It takes strength to say no to family, especially when you have the means to help. But your mama was right. This money represents her life's work, and it should be used the way she intended." Over the next few months, I learned valuable lessons about money, family, and the responsibilities that come with unexpected wealth. Some relatives stopped speaking to me when they realized I wasn't going to fund their various schemes and emergencies. Others became overly friendly in ways that felt manipulative and insincere. A few family members, however, genuinely respected Mom's wishes and supported my decision to follow her carefully laid plans. The first thing I did was quit my job at Murphy's Diner. Gary, my manager, was actually supportive when I explained that I'd inherited enough money to focus on my education. "Your mom was a smart lady," he said, as I turned in my uniform for the last time. "She used to come in here sometimes after her cleaning jobs, always ordered just coffee and maybe a piece of pie. Always talked about your future, about how proud she was of your education. She'd be happy to know you can focus on school now instead of worrying about paying bills." I used part of the inheritance to pay off my $47,000 in student loans completely. The relief of not having that monthly payment hanging over my head was incredible. But more importantly, it freed me to make career decisions based on what I wanted to do rather than what I needed to do to survive. Following Mom's written suggestion, I enrolled in an MBA program at Case Western Reserve University, one of Cleveland's most prestigious business schools. The application process was intimidating. I was competing with students who had already worked at major corporations, who had connections and experiences I'd never had. But Mom's letters had prepared me for this challenge. "You belong anywhere you want to be, Misha," she'd written in one letter. "Don't let anyone convince you that you're not smart enough, not sophisticated enough, not wealthy enough to succeed at the highest levels. You have something most people don't have. You understand what real sacrifice looks like, what it means to work for everything you get." The MBA program was challenging but rewarding. For the first time in my life, I could focus entirely on learning without worrying about how to pay rent or buy groceries. I studied real estate development, investment strategies, and business management, building on the foundation Mom had created through her example. I also started visiting Theodore Harrison's grave regularly, bringing fresh flowers just like Mom had done for 30 years. It felt like honoring both of their memories. Theodore, who had seen potential in a young immigrant woman and given her the knowledge to build wealth, and Mom, who had turned that knowledge into a legacy that would change my life forever. During my second semester, I met Professor Catherine Williams, who taught a course on entrepreneurship and family wealth management. When I shared Mom's story during a class discussion about multi-generational financial planning, Professor Williams was fascinated. "Your mother created what we call stealth wealth," she explained after class. She understood that in certain communities, financial success can create problems. People expect you to solve their problems, to fund their dreams, to be the family bank. By maintaining the appearance of modest means while building substantial assets, she protected her wealth from both external pressures and internal family dynamics. Professor Williams became an informal mentor, helping me understand the broader implications of Mom's strategy and teaching me advanced concepts about wealth preservation and growth. Under her guidance, I developed a business plan for my post-graduation career that built on Mom's real estate expertise while expanding into new areas. You have advantages that most young investors don't have. Professor Williams told me. You understand working-class communities, you speak Spanish, you know which neighborhoods are likely to gentrify because you've lived through that process. You can be a bridge between established wealth and emerging communities. 6 months after discovering Mom's hidden treasure, I made my first independent real estate investment. I bought a small duplex in Clark Fulton, a Hispanic neighborhood that reminded me of the area where I'd grown up. The property needed work, but I could see the potential that others missed, just like Mom had taught me. I spent weekends renovating the duplex myself, learning skills that Mom had never had the chance to teach me directly, but that I seemed to have inherited through her example. There was something deeply satisfying about transforming a rundown property into something beautiful and valuable, about continuing the work Mom had started decades earlier. The rental income from my first property, combined with dividends from Mom's stock portfolio, gave me financial security I'd never experienced. But more importantly, it gave me confidence that I could build on what she'd created, that I was worthy of the sacrifice she'd made. During my final semester of business school, I was approached by a local community development organization that worked with immigrant families and first-generation Americans. They wanted to create a financial literacy program specifically designed for people like Mom, hard-working individuals who had the discipline to build wealth but lacked the knowledge and connections to do it effectively. We need someone who understands both sides of this equation, said Dr. A. Maria Gonzalez, the organization's director. Someone who understands the challenges immigrant families face, but who also understands sophisticated investment strategies. Your mother's story is exactly what our community needs to hear. I agreed to develop the program using Mom's strategies as a case study while protecting her privacy and our family's personal details. The program focused on practical skills: how to research real estate investments, how to evaluate stocks, how to create and stick to long-term financial plans, how to protect wealth from family and social pressures. The first workshop I taught was held at St. Anthony's Church, the same church where Mom had attended Mass for 30 years. 25 people attended, mostly women between the ages of 30 and 50 who worked in service industries like cleaning, food service, and healthcare. Your mama sounds like my mama, said Isabella Rodriguez, a housekeeper who worked for wealthy families in Shaker Heights. Always talking about saving for the future, always making sacrifices. But I never thought someone like us could really build wealth. Someone like us built more wealth than most people ever dream of, I replied. And she did it while working in exactly the same industry you work in. The difference wasn't her income. It was her strategy, her discipline, and her long-term thinking. Over the next year, I watched workshop participants implement Mom's strategies in their own lives. Maria Santos, a hospital custodian, bought her first rental property. Carlos Mendez, who worked at a restaurant, started investing in index funds. Rosa Gutierrez, a nanny, began researching real estate trends in neighborhoods where she could afford to buy. The program grew through word of mouth, and within 18 months I was teaching workshops across Cleveland's Hispanic community. Each session began with Mom's story, how a woman who cleaned houses had quietly built a fortune while everyone underestimated her capabilities. The first lesson my mother taught me, I would tell each new group, is that wealth isn't about how much money you make. It's about how much money you keep and what you do with it. The second lesson is that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people underestimate you while you quietly build something amazing. 2 years after graduation, I started my own consulting company, Martinez Wealth Strategies, specializing in helping first-generation Americans and immigrant families build generational wealth. The business grew rapidly, fueled by referrals from satisfied clients and the credibility that came from my own family's success story. My office was located in a renovated building in Ohio City, the same neighborhood where Mom had bought one of her first rental properties in the early 1990s. From my window, I could see the community garden where she used to buy vegetables to save money on groceries, and the bus stop where she'd waited every morning to get to her cleaning jobs. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now working in a trendy neighborhood that had been transformed partly by investments like the ones Mom had made 30 years earlier. She'd seen the potential when others saw only urban decay, and now young professionals were paying premium prices to live in the area she'd helped revitalize. One afternoon, while I was reviewing investment portfolios for clients, I received a call that brought Mom's story full circle. "Ms. Martinez, this is Margaret Patterson. I think you knew my grandmother, Margaret Harrison." My heart stopped. Margaret Harrison, Theodore Harrison's wife, whose grave had hidden Mom's treasure for decades. "I'm Theodore Harrison's great-granddaughter," Margaret Patterson continued. "I live in Tampa now, but I'm in Cleveland settling my grandmother's final affairs. She passed away last month at age 93. I had so many questions, I didn't know where to start. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandmother, she was very important to my mother. That's actually why I'm calling. Grandma Margaret left some things for your family. She always talked about Elena Martinez, about how grateful she was for everything Elena did for our family after Grandpa Theodore died. She wanted to make sure you knew the whole story. We arranged to meet that weekend at a coffee shop in Lakewood, near where Margaret Patterson was staying with relatives. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and her great-grandmother's gentle manner. Grandma never moved to Florida, Margaret explained over coffee. That was a story she created to protect Elena's privacy. She actually lived in a small apartment in Lakewood until she was too old to manage on her own. She spent her last 15 years in assisted living, but she never stopped thinking about Elena and the partnership they'd maintained. Margaret pulled out a folder of documents and photographs that filled in missing pieces of Mom's story. After Grandpa Theodore died, Grandma was overwhelmed by the real estate business. She was a teacher, not an investor. She was going to sell everything and live on the proceeds, but Elena convinced her to maintain the partnership, with Elena handling the day-to-day management while Grandma provided capital when needed. The photographs showed Mom and Margaret Harrison together at various properties over the years, supervising renovations, meeting with tenants, celebrating successful sales. In every picture, Mom looked confident and professional, nothing like the humble cleaning lady our family thought they knew. Elena was brilliant, Margaret Patterson continued. Grandma always said Elena could walk through a neighborhood and predict which properties would appreciate in value within 5 years. She understood demographics, employment trends, urban development patterns, things that most professional real estate agents never learned. But why keep it secret? I asked. Why not let our family know she was successful? Grandma said Elena was worried about family pressure. She'd seen other immigrant families where sudden wealth created conflicts, where successful relatives were expected to solve everyone's problems. Elena wanted to build something sustainable for your future, not spend it all helping with other people's immediate needs. Margaret Patterson handed me a sealed envelope with my name, written in an unfamiliar handwriting. This is from Grandma Margaret. She wrote it shortly before she died, when she realized Elena was gone and you'd probably inherited the business. The letter was written in shaky handwriting, but with clear, thoughtful words. Dear Sarah, your mother was the smartest, kindest, most determined woman I ever knew. Theodore saw her potential immediately, but even he couldn't have predicted how successful she would become. Elena didn't just inherit our real estate business, she transformed it into something much bigger and more sophisticated. She understood that wealth isn't just about making money, it's about making money work for future generations. I hope you'll continue the work she started, not just for your own family, but for other families who deserve the same opportunities Elena fought to create for you. With love and admiration, Margaret Harrison. The meeting with Margaret Patterson gave me a new understanding of Mom's legacy and my responsibility to continue her work. She hadn't just built wealth for our family, she'd created a model that could be replicated by other hardworking families who had dreams bigger than their circumstances. 5 years after discovering Mom's hidden treasure, Martinez Wealth Strategies had helped over 200 families create investment portfolios and begin building generational wealth. I'd written a book about Mom's strategies, started a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, and opened a second office in Columbus to serve Ohio's growing Hispanic population. But perhaps the most meaningful development was personal. I'd met David Chen, a fellow entrepreneur who'd built his own consulting business helping Asian American families navigate real estate investments. Like me, he understood what it meant to bridge cultures and translate traditional values into modern wealth-building strategies. When David proposed to me in Riverside Cemetery, beside Theodore Harrison's monument where Mom's journey had begun, I knew she would have approved. We were married at St. Anthony's Church, with Father Martinez performing the ceremony in both English and Spanish, just as he had at Mom's funeral 5 years earlier. Our wedding reception was held at a restaurant in Ohio City, in a building that had been purchased and renovated using strategies Mom had pioneered decades earlier. As I looked around the room at family members, clients, and friends who had become successful investors, I realized that Mom's legacy extended far beyond the money she'd left me. She'd proven that immigrant families could build wealth in America if they had the right knowledge, discipline, and long-term perspective. She'd shown that success doesn't always look the way people expect it to look, and that sometimes the most powerful strategy is to work quietly while others underestimate your capabilities. The family members who had laughed at Mom's fantasy savings were no longer laughing. Miguel had started attending my financial literacy workshops and was saving to buy his first rental property. Carmen had invested her small savings in the index funds Mom had recommended, and Rosa had used some of the strategies to pay off her credit card debt and start building an emergency fund. Even Uncle Roberto, who had been most skeptical about Mom's abilities, had come to understand what she'd accomplished. Elena was playing a different game than the rest of us, he admitted during a family gathering 6 months after my wedding. While we were focused on surviving week to week, she was thinking decades ahead. We should have listened to her more, learned from her instead of dismissing her dreams. Today, when I visit Mom's grave at Riverside Cemetery, I bring Theodore and Margaret Harrison fresh flowers too. The three of them created something together that changed not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of families who have learned from their example. Mom's headstone now bears the inscription she'd requested: Elena Martinez, beloved mother, 1965-2023, todo por mi hija, everything for my daughter. But I've added a small plaque nearby that tells a more complete story. Successful real estate investor, financial strategist, and loving mother who proved that dreams backed by discipline can build generational wealth. The notebook that started this journey sits in a place of honor in my office, reminding me daily of the woman who spent 30 years building something amazing while letting everyone think she was struggling. Her story continues to inspire my clients, my family, and anyone who believes their current circumstances don't have to determine their future possibilities. Mom taught me that real wealth isn't about what people can see. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice today for the people you love tomorrow. She taught me that the most powerful investment strategy is patience, that the most valuable asset is knowledge, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them underestimate you while you quietly build something extraordinary. They laughed at my late mom's secret funds, but Elena Martinez had built a fortune on love, discipline, and strategic thinking, $1 at a time. Her legacy continues to grow, not just in the bank accounts of her family and the families we've helped, but in the changed understanding of what's possible when hardworking people have access to the right knowledge and the courage to think beyond their current circumstances. The laughter has been replaced by respect, the skepticism by admiration, and the pity by pride. Mom's secret wasn't just money, it was faith in the future, belief in the power of education and strategic thinking, and the understanding that true wealth is built through sacrifice, patience, and love. Every month, I visit Theodore Harrison's monument and update him and Mom on how their investment strategies continue to change lives. Because Elena Martinez wasn't just my mother. She was a financial genius who happened to clean houses, a real estate mogul who happened to shop at thrift stores, and a woman who understood that the greatest legacy you can leave isn't money itself, but the knowledge and values that create money. Her secret funds weren't really secret at all. They were hidden in plain sight, built through the revolutionary idea that immigrant families could accumulate wealth if they had the right strategies, the necessary discipline, and the courage to think beyond what others expected from people like them. Today, when people ask me how my mother built a fortune while working as a house cleaner, I tell them the truth. She did it the same way anyone builds wealth, through knowledge, discipline, strategic thinking, and the faith to invest in a future she might not live to see, but that her daughter would inherit. Elena Martinez proved that you don't need to start wealthy to end wealthy. You just need to start smart, stay disciplined, and never let anyone convince you that your dreams are too big for your circumstances. They laughed at her secret funds, but she built a legacy that will echo through generations, long after the laughter has been forgotten.